But these adventurous travels in countries of which the climate was so different from that of Venice proved fatal to Zeno, who died a short time after his return to Friesland. An old sailor, who had returned with the Venetian, and who said he had been for many long years a prisoner in the countries of the extreme west, gave to Sinclair such precise and tempting details of the fertility and extent of these regions, that the latter resolved to attempt their conquest with Antonio Zeno, who had rejoined his brother. But the inhabitants showed themselves everywhere so hostile, and opposed such resistance to the strangers' landing, that Sinclair, after a long and dangerous voyage, was obliged to return to Friesland. These are all the details that have been left to us, and they make us deeply regret the loss of those that Antonio should have furnished in his letters to his father Carlo, on the subject of the countries which Forster and Maltobrun have thought may be identified with Newfoundland. Who knows if in his voyage to England, and during his wanderings as far as Thule, Christopher Columbus may not have heard mentioned the ancient expeditions of the Northmen and the Zeni, and if this information may not have appeared to him a strange confirmation of the theories which he held, and of the ideas for whose realization he came to claim the protection of the King of England. From the collection of facts which have been here briefly given, it follows that America was known to Europeans and had been colonized before the time of Columbus. But in consequence of various circumstances, and foremost among these must be placed the rarity of communication between the people in the north of Europe and those in the south, the discoveries made by the Northmen were only vaguely known in Spain and Portugal. Judging by appearances, we of the present day know much more on this subject than did the fellow countrymen and contemporaries of Columbus. If the Genoese mariner had been informed of the existence of some rumors, he classed them with the information he had collected in the Cape de Verde Islands, and with his classical recollections of the famous island of Antillia and the Atlantides of Plato. From this information, which came from so many different sides, the certainty awoke within him that the East could be reached by the western route. However it may be, his glory remains whole and entire. He is really the discoverer of America, and not those who were carried thither in spite of themselves by chances of wind and storm, without their having any intention of reaching the shores of Asia, which Christopher Columbus would have done, had not the way been barred by America. The information that we are about to give on the family of Cortereal, although it may be much more complete than that which can be met with in biographical dictionaries, is still extremely vague. Nevertheless, we must content ourselves with it, for up to this time, history has not collected further details concerning this race of intrepid navigators. Joe Vaz Cortereal was the natural son of a gentleman named Vasco Anz de Costa, who had received the sobriquet of Cortereal from the King of Portugal, on account of the magnificence of his house and followers. Devoted like so many other gentlemen of this period to seafaring adventure, Joe Vaz had carried off in Galicia a young girl named Maria de Barca, who became his wife. After having been gentleman usher to the Infante Don Fernando, he was sent by the king to the North Atlantic, with Alvaro Martins Homem. The two navigators saw an island known from this time by the name of Terra dos Bacalhaus, the land of codfish, which must really have been Newfoundland. The date of this discovery is approximately fixed by the fact that on their return they landed at Terceira, and finding the captainship vacant by the death of Jacome de Bruges, they went to ask for it from the Infanta Dona Brights, the widow of the Infante Don Fernando. She bestowed it upon them on condition that they would divide it between them, a fact which is confirmed by a deed of gift dated from Evora, the 2nd of April, 1464. Though one cannot guarantee the authenticity of this discovery of America, it is nevertheless an ascertained fact that Cortereal's voyage must have been signalized by some extraordinary event. Donations of such importance as this were only made to those who had rendered some great service to the crown. When Vaz Cortereal was settled at Terceira fro to 1497, he caused a fine palace to be built in the town of Angra, where he lived with his 3 children. His third son, Gaspard, after having been in the service of King Emmanuel, when the latter was only Duke de Beja, had felt himself attracted, while still young, to the enterprises of discovery which had rendered his father illustrious. By an act dated from Sintra, the 12th of March, 1500, King Emmanuel made a gift to Gaspard Cortereal of any islands or terra firma which he might discover, and the king added this valuable information, that already and at other times he had sought for them on his own account and at his own expense. For Gaspard Cortereal, this was not his first essay. Probably, his researches may have been directed to the parts where his father had discovered the island of Cod. At his own expense, although with the assistance of the king, Gaspard Cortereal fitted out 2 vessels at the commencement of the summer of 1500, and after having touched at Terceira, he sailed towards the northwest. His first discovery was of a land of which the fertile and verdant aspect seems to have charmed him. This was Canada. He saw there a great river bearing ice along with it on its course, the St. Lawrence, which some of his companions mistook for an arm of the sea, and to which he gave the name of Rio Nevado. Its volume is so considerable that it is not probable that this country is an island. Besides, it must be completely covered with a very thick coating of snow to produce such a stream of water. The houses in this country were of wood and covered with skins and furs. The inhabitants were unacquainted with iron, but used swords made of sharpened stones, and their arrows were tipped with fish bones or stones. Tall and well-made, their faces and bodies were painted in different colors according to taste. They wore golden and copper bracelets and dressed themselves in garments of fur. Cortereal pursued his voyage and arrived at the Cape of Bacalhaus, fishes which are found in such great quantities upon this coast that they hinder the advance of the caravels. Then he followed the shore for a stretch of 600 miles, fro degrees to 60 degrees or even more, naming the islands, the rivers, and the gulfs that he met with, as is proved by Terra do Labrador, Bahia de Conseco, and sea, and landing and holding intercourse with the natives. Severe cold and a veritable river of gigantic blocks of ice prevented the expedition from going farther north, and it returned to Portugal, bringing back with it 57 natives. The very year of his return, on the 15th of May, 1501, Gaspard Cortereal, in pursuance of an order of the 15th of April, received provisions and left Lisbon in the hope of extending the field of his discoveries. But from this time, he is never again mentioned. Michael Cortereal, his brother, who was the first gentleman usher to the king, then requested and obtained permission to go and seek his brother and to pursue his enterprise. By an act of the 15th of January, 1502, a deed of gift conveyed to him the half of the terra firma and islands which his brother might have discovered. Setting out on the 10th of May of this year with 3 vessels, Michael Cortereal reached Newfoundland, where he divided his little squadron, so that each of the vessels might explore the coasts separately while he fixed the place of rendezvous. But at the time fixed, he did not reappear, and the 2 other vessels, after waiting for him till the 20th of August, set out on their return to Portugal. In 1503, the king sent 2 caravels to try to obtain news of the 2 brothers, but the search was in vain, and they returned without having acquired any information. When Vasco Annes, the last of the brothers Cortereal, who was captain and governor of the islands of St. George and Terceira, and Alcade Moore of the town of Tavilla, became acquainted with these sad events, he resolved to fit out a vessel at his own cost and to go and search for his brothers. The king, however, would not allow him to go, fearing to lose the last of this race of good servants. Upon the maps of this period, Canada is often indicated by the name of Terra dos Cortereals, a name which is sometimes extended much further south, embracing a great part of North America. All that concerns John and Sebastian Cabot has been until recently shrouded by a mist, which is not even now completely dissipated, notwithstanding the conscientious labors of Biddle the American in 1831 and of our compatriot M. Davisac, as also those of Mr. Nichols the Englishman, who, taking advantage of the discoveries made among the English, Spanish, and Venetian archives, has built up an imposing monument, of which some parts, however, are open to discussion. It is from the 2 last-named works that we shall draw the materials for this rapid sketch, but principally from Mr. Nichols' book, which has this advantage over the smaller volume of M. Davisac, that it relates the whole life of Sebastian Cabot. Sebastian Cabot. Sebastian Cabot. From an old print. It has been found impossible to determine with certainty either the name or the nationality of John Cabot, and still less to settle the period of his birth. John Caboto or Cabot must have been born, if not in Genoa itself, as M. Davisac asserts, at least in the neighborhood of that town, possibly at Castiglione, about the first quarter of the 15th century. Some historians have considered that he was an Englishman, and perhaps Mr. Nichols from national considerations is inclined to adopt this opinion. At least, this seems to be the meaning of the expressions used by him. What we do know without room for doubt is that John Cabot came to London to occupy himself with commerce, and that he soon settled at Bristol, then the second town in the kingdom, in one of the suburbs which had received the name of Cathay, probably from the number of Venetians who resided there, and the trade carried on by them with the countries of the extreme east. It was at Bristol that Cabot's two youngest children were born, Sebastian and Sancho, if we may rely upon the following account given by the old chronicler Eden. Sebastian Cabot told me that he was born at Bristol, and that at 4 years of age he went with his father to Venice, returning with him to England some years later. This made people imagine that he was born at Venice. In 1476, John Cabot was at Venice, and there on the 29th of March he received letters of naturalization, which proved that he was not a native of this city, and that he must have merited the honor by some service rendered to the Republic. M. Davisac is inclined to think that he devoted himself to the study of cosmography and navigation, perhaps even in company with the celebrated Florentine Paul Toscanelli, with whose theories upon the distribution of land and sea on the surface of the globe he would certainly be acquainted at this time. He may also have heard mention made of the islands situated in the Atlantic and known by the names of Antalya, the land of the seven cities, or Brazil. What seems more certain is that his business affairs took him to the Levant, and it is said to Mecca, and that while there he would learn from what country came the spices, which then constituted the most important branch of Venetian commerce. Whatever value we may attach to these speculative theories, it is at least certain that John Cabot founded an important mercantile house at Bristol. His son Sebastian, who in these first voyages had acquired an inclination for the sea, studied navigation, as far as it was then known, and made some excursions on the sea to render himself as familiar with the practice of this art as he already was with its theory. For 7 years past, says the Spanish ambassador in a dispatch of the 25th of July, 1498, speaking of an expedition commanded by Cabot, the people of Bristol have fitted out 2, 3, or 4 caravels every year to go in search of the island of Brazil and of the 7 cities, according to the ideas of the Genoese. At this time, the whole of Europe resounded with the fame of the discoveries of Columbus. It awoke in me, says Sebastian Cabot, in a narrative preserved by Ramusio, a great desire and a kind of ardor in my heart to do myself also something famous, and knowing by examining the globe that if I sailed by the west wind I should reach India more rapidly, I at once made my project known to His Majesty, who was much satisfied with it. The king to whom Cabot addressed himself was the same Henry Roman VII, who some years before had refused all support to Christopher Columbus. It is evident that he received with favor the project which John and Sebastian Cabot had just submitted to him, and though Sebastian, in the fragment which we have just quoted, attributes to himself alone all the honor of the project, it is not less true that his father was the promoter of the enterprise, as the following charter shows, which we translate in an abridged form. We, Henry, permit our well-beloved Jehan Cabot, citizen of Venice, and Louis, Sebastian, and Sancho, his sons, under our flag, and with 5 vessels of the tonnage and crew which they shall judge suitable, to discover at their own expense and charge. We grant to them, as well as to their heirs and assigns, license to occupy, possess, at the charge of by them, upon the profits, benefits, and advantages accruing from this navigation, to pay us in merchandise or in money the 5th part of the profit thus obtained, for each of their voyages, every time that they shall return to the port of Bristol, at which port they shall be compelled to land. We promise and guarantee to them, their heirs and assigns, that they shall be exempt from all custom-house duties on the merchandise which they shall bring from the countries thus discovered. We command and direct all our subjects, as well on land as on the sea, to render assistance to the said Jehan and to his sons, given at the 5th day of March, 1495. Such was the charter that was granted to John Cabot and his sons upon their return from the American continent, and not as certain authors have pretended, anterior to this voyage. From the time that the news of the discovery made by Columbus had reached England, that is to say, probably in 1493, John and Sebastian Cabot prepared the expedition at their own expense, and set out at the beginning of the year 1494 with the idea of reaching Cathay and finally the Indies. There can be no doubt upon this point, for in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris is preserved an unique copy of the map engraved in 1544, that is to say, in the lifetime of Sebastian Cabot, which mentions this voyage and the precise and exact date of the discovery of Cape Breton. It is probable that we must attribute to the intrigues of the Spanish ambassador the delay which occurred in Cabot's expedition, for the whole of the year 1496 passed without the voyage being accomplished. The following year he set out at the beginning of summer. After having again sighted the Terra Bonavista, he followed the coast, and was not long in perceiving to his great disappointment that it trended towards the north. Then sailing along it to make sure if I could not find some passage, I could not perceive any, and having advanced as far as 56 degrees, and seeing that at this point the land turned towards the east, I despaired of finding any passage, and I put about to examine the coast in this direction towards the equinoctial line, always with the same object of finding a passage to the Indies, and in the end, I reached the country now called Florida, where as provisions were beginning to run short, I resolved to return to England. This narrative, of which we have given the commencement above, was related by Cabot to Fracastor 40 or 50 years after the event. Also, is it not astonishing that Cabot mixes up in it two perfectly distinct voyages, that of 1494 and that of 1497? Let us add some reflections on this narrative. The first land scene was, without doubt, the North Cape, the northern extremity of the island of Cape Breton, and the island which is opposite to it is that of Prince Edward, long known by the name of St. John's Island. Cabot probably penetrated into the estuary of the St. Lawrence, which he took for an arm of the sea, near to the place where Quebec now stands, and coasted along the northern shore of the Gulf, so that he did not see the coast of Labrador stretching away in the east. He took Newfoundland for an archipelago and continued his course to the south, not doubtless as far as Florida as he states himself, the time occupied by the voyage making it impossible that he can have descended so low, but as far as Chesapeake Bay. These were the countries which the Spaniards afterwards called Terra de Estevam Gomez. On the 3rd of February, 1498, King Henry Roman VII signed at Westminster some new letters patent. He empowered John Cabot, or his representative, being duly authorized, to take in English ports 6 vessels of 200 tons burden, and to procure all that should be required for their equipment at the same price as if it were for the crown. He was allowed to take on board such master mariners, pages, and other subjects as might of their own accord wish to go, and pass with him to the recently discovered land and islands. John Cabot bore the expense of the equipment of 2 vessels, and 3 others were fitted out at the cost of the merchants of Bristol. In all probability it was death, a sudden and unexpected death, which prevented John Cabot from taking the command of this expedition. His son Sebastian then assumed the direction of the fleet, which carry men and provisions for a year. After having sighted land at 45 degrees, Sebastian Cabot followed the coast as far as 58 degrees, perhaps even higher, but then it became so cold, and although it was the month of July, there was so much floating ice about that it would have been impossible to go further northwards. The days were very long, and the nights excessively light, an interesting detail by which to fix the latitude reached, for we know that below the 60th parallel of latitude the longest days are 18 hours. These various reasons made Sebastian Cabot decide to put about, and he touched at the Bacalhaus Islands, of which the inhabitants, who were clothed in the skins of animals, were armed with bow and arrows, lance, javelin, and wooden sword. The navigators here caught a great number of codfish. They were even so numerous, says an old narrative, that they hindered ships from advancing. After having sailed along the coast of America as far as 38 degrees, Cabot set out for England, where he arrived at the beginning of autumn. This voyage had indeed a threefold object, that of discovery, commerce, and colonization, as is shown by the number of vessels which took part in it and the strength of the crews. Nevertheless, it does not appear that Cabot landed anyone, or that he made any attempts at forming a settlement, either in Labrador or in Hudson's Bay, which he was destined to explore more completely in 1517, in the reign of Henry Roman VIII, or even to the south of the Bacalhaos, known by the general name of Newfoundland. At the close of this expedition, which was almost entirely unproductive, we lose sight of Sebastian Cabot, if not completely, at least so as to be insufficiently informed about his deeds and voyages the traveller Hojda, whose various enterprises we have related above, had left Spain in the month of May, 1499. We know that in this voyage he met with an Englishman at Caquibaco, on the coast of America. Can this have been Cabot? Nothing has come to light to enable us to settle this point, but we may believe that Cabot did not remain idle, and that he would be likely to undertake some fresh expedition. What we do know is that in spite of the solemn engagements that he had made with Cabot, the King of England granted certain privileges of trading in the countries which he had discovered to the Portuguese and to the merchants of Bristol. This ungenerous manner of recognizing his services wounded the navigator, and decided him to accept the offers which had been made to him on different occasions to enter the Spanish service. From the death of Vespucius, which happened in 1512, Cabot was the navigator held in most renown. To attach him to himself, Ferdinand wrote on the 13th of September, 1512, to Lord Willoughby, commander-in-chief of the troops which had been transported to Italy to treat with the Venetian navigator. Discoveries of John and Sebastian Cabot. Discoveries of John and Sebastian Cabot. As soon as he arrived in Castile, Cabot received the rank of captain by an edict dated the 20th of October, 1512, with a salary of 5,000 maravedis. Seville was fixed upon for his residence, until an opportunity might arise of turning his talents and experience to account. There was a plan on foot for his taking the command of a very important expedition, when Ferdinand the Catholic died, on the 23rd of January, 1516. Cabot returned at once to England, having probably obtained leave of absence. Eden tells us that the following year Cabot was appointed with Sir Thomas Pert to the command of a fleet which was to reach China by the northwest. On the 11th of June, he was in Hudson's Bay at 671.2 degrees of latitude. The sea free from ice spread itself out before him so far that he reckoned upon success in his enterprise, when the faint-heartedness of his companion, together with the cowardice and mutinous spirit of the crews, who refused to go any further, obliged him to return to England. In his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Ortelius traces the shape of Hudson's Bay as it really is. He even indicates at its northern extremity a strait leading northwards. How can the geographer have attained to such exactness? Who, says Mr. Nichols, can have given him the information set forth in his map, if not Cabot? On his return to England, Cabot found the country ravaged by a horrible plague, which put a stop even to commercial transactions. Soon, either because the time of his leave had expired, or that he wished to escape from the pestilence, or that he was recalled to Spain, the Venetian navigator returned to that country. In 1518, on the 5th of February, Cabot was made pilot major, with a salary which, added to that which he already had, made a total of 125,000 maravedis, say 300 ducats. He did not actually exercise the functions of his office till Charles V returned from England. His principal duty consisted in examining pilots, who were not allowed to go to the Indies until after having passed this examination. This epoch was by no means favorable to great maritime expeditions. The struggle between France and Spain absorbed all the resources, both in men and money, of these two countries. Cabot, too, who seems to have adopted science for his fatherland much more than any particular country, made some overtures to Contarini, the ambassador of Venice, to take service on board the fleets of the Republic. But when the favorable answer of the Council of Ten arrived, he had other projects in his head, and did not carry his attempt any further. Cabot presides over a conference of cosmographers. Cabot presides over a conference of cosmographers. In the month of April, 1524, Cabot presided at a conference of mariners and cosmographers, which met at Badajoz, to discuss the question whether the Moluccas belonged, according to the celebrated Treaty of Tordesillas, to Spain or Portugal. On the 31st of May, it was decided that the Moluccas were within the Spanish waters by 20 degrees. Perhaps this resolution of the junta, of which Cabot was president, and which again placed in the hands of Spain a great part of the spice trade, was not without its influence upon the resolutions of the Council of the Indies. However this may be, in the month of September of the same year, Cabot was authorized to take the command of 3 vessels of 100 tons and a small caravel carrying together 150 men with the title of Captain General. The declared aim of this voyage was to pass through the Strait of Magellan, carefully to explore the western coast of America, and to reach the Moluccas, where they would take in on their return a cargo of spices. The month of August, 1525, had been fixed upon as the date of departure, but the intrigues of Portugal succeeded in delaying it until April 1526. Different circumstances seem from this moment to have augured ill for the voyage. Cabot had only a nominal authority, and the association of merchants who had defrayed the expenses of the equipment, not accepting him willingly as chief, had found means to oppose all the plans of the Venetian sailor. Thus it was that in place of the man whom he had appointed as second in command, another was imposed upon him, and that instructions destined to be unsealed when at sea were delivered to each captain. They contained this absurd arrangement, that in case of the death of the Captain General, 11 individuals were to succeed him each in his turn. Was not this an encouragement given to assassination? Scarcely was the fleet out of sight of land, when discontent appeared. The rumor spread that the Captain General was not equal to his task. Then, as they saw that these calumnies did not affect him, they pretended that the flotilla was already short of provisions. The mutiny broke out as soon as land was reached, but Cabot was not the man to allow himself to be annihilated by it. He had suffered too much from Sir Thomas Pert's cowardice to bear such an insult. In order to nip the evil in the bud, he had the mutinous captains seized, and notwithstanding their reputation and the brilliancy of their past services, he made them get into a boat and abandoned them on the shore. 4 months afterwards, they had the good luck to be picked up by a Portuguese expedition, which seems to have had orders to thwart the plans of Cabot. The Venetian navigator then penetrated into the Rio de la Plata, the exploration of which had been commenced by his predecessor, the pilot Major de Solis. The expedition was not then composed of more than 2 vessels, one having been lost during the voyage. Cabot sailed up the Argent River and discovered an island which he called Francis Gabriel, and upon which he built the fort of San Salvador, entrusting the command of it to Antonio de Grajeda. Cabot had the keel removed from one of his caravels, and with it, being towed by his small boats, entered the Parana, built a new fort at the confluence of the Carcarama and Tercero, and after having thus secured his line of retreat, he pursued the course of these rivers farther into the interior. Arriving at the confluence of the Parana and Paraguay, he followed the second, the direction of which agreed best with his project of reaching the region of the west, where silver was to be obtained. But it was not long before the aspect of the country changed, and the attitude of the inhabitants altered also. Until now, they had collected in crowds, astonished at the sight of the vessels, but upon the cultivated shores of the Paraguay, they courageously opposed the strangers' landing, and 3 Spaniards having tried to knock down the fruit from palm tree, a struggle took place, in which 300 natives lost their lives. This victory had disabled 25 Spaniards. It was too much for Cabot, who rapidly removed his wounded to the Fort San Spirito and retired, still presenting a bold front to the enemy. Cabot had already sent 2 of his companions to the emperor to acquaint him with the attempt at revolt of the captains, to explain to him the motives which obliged him to modify the course marked out for his voyage, and to request aid from him both in men and provisions. The answer arrived at last. The emperor approved of what Cabot had done, and ordered him to colonize the country in which he had just made a settlement, but did not send him either one man or a single maravedi. Cabot tried to procure the resources which he needed in the country, and caused some attempts at cultivation to be commenced. At the same time, to keep his troops in exercise, He reduced the neighboring nations to obedience, had some forts built, and again sailing up the Paraguay he reached Potosi and the watercourses of the Andes which feed the basin of the Atlantic. At last he prepared to enter Peru, from whence came the gold and silver which he had seen in the possession of the natives, but it needed more troops than he could muster to attempt the conquest of this vast region. The emperor, however, was quite unable to send him any. His European wars absorbed all his resources, the Cortes refused to vote new subsidies, and the Moluccas had just been pledged to Portugal. In this state of affairs, after having occupied the country for 5 years and waited all this time for the assistance which never came, Cabot decided to evacuate a part of his settlements, and he returned with some of his people to Spain. The rest, amounting to 120 men who were left to guard the fort of San Spirito, after many vicissitudes which cannot be related here, perished by the hands of the Indians, or were obliged to take refuge in the Portuguese settlements on the coast of Brazil. It is to the horses imported by Cabot that is due the wonderful race of wild horses which may be seen in large troops on the pampas of La Plata at the present day. This was the only result of the expedition. Some time after his return to Spain, Cabot resigned his office and went to Bristol, where he settled about 1548, that is to say, at the beginning of the reign of Edward Roman VI. What were the motives of this fresh change? Was Cabot discontented at having been left to his own resources during his expedition? Was he hurt at the manner in which his services were recompensed? It is impossible to say. But Charles V took advantage of Cabot's departure to deprive him of his pension, which Edward Roman VI hastened to replace, causing him to receive 250 marks annually, about 116 L, and a fraction, which was a considerable sum for that period. The post which Cabot occupied in England seems to be best expressed by the name of Intendant of the Navy. Under the authority of the King and Council, he appears to have superintended all maritime affairs. He issues licenses, he examines pilots, he frames instructions, he draws maps, a varied and complicated function for which he possessed the rare gift of both practical and theoretical knowledge. At the same time, he instructed the young king in cosmography, explained to him the variation of the compass, and was successful in interesting him in nautical matters and in the glory resulting from maritime discoveries. It was a high and almost unique situation. Cabot used it to put into execution a project which he had long cherished. At this period, we may almost say there was no trade in England. All commerce was in the hands of the Hanseatic towns, Antwerp, Hamburg, Bremen, and these companies of merchants had, on various occasions, obtained considerable reductions in import duties, and had ended by monopolizing the English trade. Cabot held that Englishmen possessed as good qualifications as these merchants for becoming manufacturers, and that the already powerful navy which England possessed might assist marvelously in the export of the products of the soil and of the manufactures. What was the use of having recourse to strangers when people could do their own business? If they had been unable up to this time to reach Cathay and India by the northwest, might they not endeavor to reach it by the northeast? And if they did not succeed, would they not find in this direction more commercial and more civilized people than the miserable Esquimaux on the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland? Cabot assembled some leading London merchants, laid his projects before them, and formed them into an association, of which on the 14th of December, 1551, he was named president for life. At the same time, he exerted himself most vigorously with the king, and having made him understand the wrong which the monopoly enjoyed by strangers did to his own subjects, he obtained its abolition on the 23rd of February, 1551, and inaugurated the practice of free trade. The Association of English Merchants, under the name of Merchant Adventurers, hastened to have some vessels built, adapted to the difficulties to be encountered in the navigation of the Arctic regions. The first improvement which the English marine owed to Cabot was the sheathing of the keels, which he had seen done in Spain, but which had not hitherto been practiced in England. A flotilla of 3 vessels was assembled at Deptford. They were the Buona Speranza, of which the command was given to Sir Hugh Willoughby, a brave gentleman who had earned a high reputation in war, the Buona Confidencia, Captain Cornel Durforth, and the Bonaventure, Captain Richard Chancellor, a clever sailor and a particular friend of Cabot's. He received the title of Pilot Major. The sailing master of the Bonaventure was Stephen Burruff, an accomplished mariner who was destined to make numerous voyages in the North Seas and later to become pilot-in-chief for England. Although age and his important duties prevented Cabot from placing himself at the head of the expedition, he wished at least to preside over all the details of the equipment. He himself wrote out the instructions, which have been preserved, and which prove the prudence and skill of this distinguished navigator. He there recommends the use of the logline, an instrument intended to measure the speed of the vessel, and he desires that the journal of the events happening at sea may be kept with regularity, and that all information as to the character, manners, habits, and resources of the people visited, and the productions of the country, may be recorded in writing. The sailors were to offer no violence to the natives, but to act towards them with courtesy. All blasphemy and swearing was to be punished with severity, and also drunkenness. The religious exercises are prescribed, prayers are to be said morning and evening, and the Holy Scriptures are to be read once in the day. Cabot ends by recommending union and concord above all, and reminds the captains of the greatness of their enterprise and the honor which they might hope to gain. Finally, he promises them to add his prayers to theirs for the success of their common work. The squadron set sail on the 20th of May, 1558, in presence of the court assembled at Greenwich, amid an immense concourse of people, after fetes and rejoicings at which the king, who was ill, could not be present. Near the Lofoten Islands, on the coast of Norway at the bearing of Wardhus, the squadron was separated from the Bonaventure. Carried away by the storm, Willoughby's two vessels touched, without doubt, at Nova Zembla and were forced by the ice to return southwards. On the 18th of September, they entered the port formed by the mouth of the river Arzina in East Lapland. Some time afterwards, the Buona Confidencia, separated from Willoughby by a fresh tempest, returned to England. As to the latter, some Russian fishermen found his vessel the following year, in the midst of the ice. The whole crew had died of cold. This, at least, is what we are led to suppose from the journal kept by the unfortunate Willoughby up to the month of January, 1554. Chancellor, after having waited in vain for his two consorts at the rendezvous which had been agreed upon in case of separation, thought they must have outsailed him, and rounding the North Cape, he entered a vast gulf, which was none other than the White Sea. He then landed at the mouth of the Dwina, near the monastery of St. Nicholas, on the spot upon which the town of Archangel was soon to stand. The inhabitants of these desolate places told him that the country was under the dominion of the Grand Duke of Russia. Chancellor resolved at once to go to Moscow, in spite of the enormous distance which separated him from it. The Tsar then on the throne was Ivan Roman IV, Wassiliewicz, called the Terrible. For some time before this, the Russians had shaken off the Tartar yoke, and Ivan had united all the petty rival principalities in one body politic, of which the power was already becoming considerable. The situation of Russia, exclusively continental, far from any frequented sea, isolated from the rest of Europe, of which it did not yet form part, so much were its habits and manners still Asiatic, promised success to Chancellor. Chancellor received by the Tsar. Chancellor received by the Tsar. The Tsar, who up to this time had not been able to procure European merchandise, except by way of Poland, and who wished to gain access to the German seas, saw with pleasure the attempts of the English to establish a trade which would be beneficial to both parties. He not only received Chancellor courteously, but he made him most advantageous offers, granted him great privileges, and encouraged him, by the kindness of his reception, to repeat his voyage. Chancellor sold his merchandise to great advantage, and after taking on board another cargo of furs, of seal and whale oils, copper, and other products, returned to England, carrying a letter from the Tsar. The advantages which the company of merchant adventurers had derived from this first voyage encouraged them to attempt a second. So Chancellor the following year made a fresh voyage to Archangel and took two of the company's agents to Russia, who concluded an advantageous treaty with the Tsar. Then he set out again for England with an ambassador and his suite, sent by Ivan to Great Britain. Of the four vessels which composed the flotilla, one was lost on the coast of Norway, another as it left Drontheim, and the Bonaventure, on board of which were Chancellor and the Ambassador, foundered in the Bay of Pitsligo on the east coast of Scotland on the 10th of November, 1556. Chancellor was drowned in the wreck, being less fortunate than the Muscovite ambassador, who had the good luck to escape, but the presents and merchandise which he was carrying to England were lost. Wreck of the Bonaventure. Wreck of the Bonaventure. Such was the commencement of the Anglo-Russian Company. A goodly number of expeditions succeeded each other in those parts, but it would be beside our purpose to give an account of them. Let us now return to Cabot. It was in 1554 that Queen Mary of England was married to Philip Roman II, King of Spain. When the latter came to England, he showed himself very ill-disposed towards Cabot, who had abandoned the service of Spain, and who, at this very moment, was procuring for England a commerce which would soon immensely increase the maritime power of an already formidable country. Thus we are not surprised to learn that 8 days after the landing of the King of Spain, Cabot was forced to resign his office and his pension, both of which had been bestowed upon him for life by Edward Roman VI. Worthington was nominated in his place. Mr. Nichols thinks that this dishonorable man, who had had some quarrels with the law, had a secret mission to seize among Cabot's plans, maps, instructions, and projects, those which could be of use to Spain. The fact is that all these documents are now lost, at least unless they may yet be discovered among the archives of Simancas. At the end of this period, history completely loses sight of the old mariner. The same mystery which hangs over his birth also envelopes the place and date of his death. His immense discoveries, his cosmographical works, his study of the variations of the magnetic needle, his wisdom, his humane disposition, and his honorable conduct place Sebastian Cabot in the foremost rank among discoverers. A figure lost in the shadow and vagueness of legends until our own day, Cabot owes it to his biographers, to Biddle, 500, Avazak, and Nichols, that he is now better known, more highly appreciated, and for the first time really placed in the light. Chapter 2. Polar Expeditions. John Verrazano, Jacques Cartier and his 3 voyages to Canada, the town of Hochelaga, tobacco, the scurvy voyage of Roberval Martin Frobisher and his voyages, John Davis, Barentz and Heemskirk, Spitzbergen, winter season at Nova Zembla, return to Europe, relics of the expedition. Fro to 1524, France had stood aloof, officially at least, from enterprises of discovery and colonization. But Francis I could not look on quietly while the power of his rival Charles V received a large addition by the conquest of Mexico. He therefore ordered John Verrazano, a Venetian who was in his service, to make a voyage of exploration. We will pause here for a short time, although the various places may have already been visited on several occasions, because for the first time the banner of France floats over the shores of the New World. This exploration, besides, was to prepare the way for those of Jacques Cartier and of Champlain in Canada, as well as for the unlucky experiments in colonization of Jean Ribaut and of Laudonnière, the sanguinary voyage of reprisals of Gergues, and Villegagnon's attempt at a settlement in Brazil. We possess no biographical details with regard to Verrazano. Under what circumstances did he enter the service of France? What was his title to the command of such an expedition? Nothing is known of the Venetian traveler, for all we possess of his writings is the Italian translation of his report to Francis I, published in the collection of Ramusio. The French translation of this Italian translation exists in an abridged form in Lescarbot's work on New France and in the Histoire des Voyages. For our very rapid epitome, we shall make use of the Italian text of Ramusio, except in some passages where Lescarbot's translation has appeared to give an idea of the rich, original, and marvelously modulated language of the 16th century. Map of Newfoundland and of the mouth of the St. Lawrence.